So today, our host and our facilitators are Dr. Karen Ward, Director of NIRN, and Sophia couldn't be with us today. So I'm super excited to introduce to you Yolanda Perkins, another colleague of ours, an implementation specialist at NIRN. She will be another primary facilitator, and then I am Rebecca Hornack. I will be monitoring today's session. So I'm going to open it up real quick to Karen and Yolanda to go ahead and say hi to you guys.
Karen, would you like to start?
Sure, Yolanda, I was giving you space. Welcome, everybody. We're so excited that we've got such a wonderful, diverse group with us today, and we're looking forward to engaging in some shared learning together.
Hello, everyone. I am so excited to be part of this session with you today and looking forward to learning together. So, Yolanda Perkins, looking forward to working with you through this session.
So our objectives for today, we are going to be reflecting real quick on our learnings from session 2, what we took away, what was your feedback. We are going to dive deep into those core competencies. We're going to be examining each of them and how you rated. We did send you some pre-work. If you didn't get a chance to get to the pre-work, that is okay. You will have time to do some self-reflection throughout our session to really think about where you fall in regards to your skill set with these core competencies. We're also going to attach those core competencies to the work that we do as implementation specialists within that initial implementation stage. So we'll go through the activities and the outcomes, and then we are actually going to have a conversation today around some of our own experiences as implementation specialists. And then you yourselves will have a chance to get together and barrier bust. We asked you to bring to the group a barrier that you feel like you are hitting with initial implementation, and depend on your colleagues and peers in today's session to help you barrier bust. So here we go. Couple of logistics and reminders as we're going through today's session. This is an interactive webinar, meaning we are going to provide some content, but we want to make it as engaging and as interactive as possible. So what we're asking you to do is keep your video on as much as possible, especially when you're in breakout rooms and having conversations. Be sure you're on mute when you're in the main session. And really, when you're in those breakout rooms, engage in conversation. That's why we brought you all together, is to learn from one another, to connect. And today we're mixing up the groups. So if you've been part of the sessions 1 and 2, you were in some home groups. Well, guess what? We're mixing you up so you can meet some new colleagues today and hopefully walk away with some new networks. Think about utilizing your reactions. And as always, we have our chat going. What was your feedback from session 2? This is always my favorite part after a session, is jumping into the feedback, taking a look at your learnings. And you all found the case studies very, very helpful. It was a nice overview of the domains of the core competencies, and the initial information was really helpful in regards to grounding your knowledge and growing. So we're growing in that respect, right? So that first webinar, we just did a quick, big overview. The second webinar, we dove into those domains, and today we are going to jump right into the 15 core competencies. Your feedback for us and to make improvements. Instead of case studies, can participants talk to their group? So that's what you're doing today for your collaborative challenge. You're gonna just be able to talk, no note taking today, just good solid conversation. I see some claps in the windows. Some people are really excited that we changed that up. More time to prepare for the session in advance. We tried to get the information out to you in advance, about a week, and we'll continue to improve on that. And then the connection between stages and core competencies needs to be clear. So we're gonna provide that for you hopefully today with our storytelling. Some lessons learned about the core competencies and the domains within the profile. From co-creation engagement, you guys really talked about the layers. Your big takeaway was the fact that these are so interconnected, and it's like peeling an onion back, and there's more and more and more and more, and you can always improve, and they are so interconnected. With the ongoing improvement, if you were looking at those case studies, communication was key here. The postings were all about communication, understanding that context, really being able to dive deep into the work with teams. And then sustaining change, one of the key pieces we pulled away was this concept of, you have to grow your team, you have to grow your leaders, you have to grow your champions, because that's how you sustain the work, right? That was a piece that you really, really pulled out from your conversations. All right. Any thoughts or questions regarding sessions 2? If you were able to attend, any other additional takeaways that we may have missed that you want to share with us, feel free and go ahead and pop it right in the chat. And with that, we do have a couple of updates for you. I am super excited to share with you some NIRN updates that are coming down the pipeline. You do have a copy of the presentation in your agenda, so you'll be able to access all these links. But we have some learning modules specifically around the core competencies we wanted to highlight on the hub. That's cultivating leadership, building teams, and co-learning. Understanding context is coming soon. That's going to be our next release, and I believe it's going to be late fall when that is released. So we are super excited to see that coming. We had a recent blog by Stephanie Kennedy and Kathleen Ryan Jackson on the team around PDSA cycles and improvement and implementation sciences. That's really a nice quick read and something you might want to share with your teams. And then finally, a couple of big items actually for one of NIRN's projects, the SysEP Center. They had a brief coming out, or they just released a brief on what is fidelity. And 2 really big peer-reviewed research articles were shared out, one from our colleagues, co-authored with our colleagues from Minnesota. So we just wanted to do a quick shout out for them. When you're taking a look at these resources, we are also offering a webinar on what is fidelity that SysEP is offering. So I'm going to have Amelia drop the registration link right in the chat, and it's also on your agenda, and that's August 17th. So we're going to dive deep into that concept of fidelity on August 17th, and you're more than welcome to register and join. All right, so lots of work, lots of information coming down. Make sure you join us on social. And before I turn it over to Karen, if you're on Twitter today, we're at #ImpPractice22. And now I'm going to turn it over.
I believe Yolanda, I have in the notes, this is you, right?
That's me. I'm here to help set the stage for today. So next slide, please. So as Rebecca was just going over some of the information that you have from session 2 and some of the connections that you made. And so as we know, as implementation support practitioners, we need to be aware of those skills needed to support effective implementation. And those skills align with those 6 principles introduced in the previous sessions, being empathetic, being curious, being committed, using critical thinking, embracing cross-disciplinary approaches, and advancing equity. And then those are all supported with the 3 competency domains: co-creation and engagement, ongoing improvement, and sustaining change. So we heard your feedback about wanting more information about those competencies. So today we're going to go in and do a brief overview of the domains, but then have time to discuss and reflect on the 4 to 6 competencies in each one of those domains. So I'm excited to have the opportunity to work with you today and discuss with you today how each of those competencies impacts our work. And then after we review each of the domains and the competencies, we'll ask you to anonymously share your reflections or ratings from the Implementation Specialist Competencies Rating Form that you completed. And as Rebecca mentioned, if you had not yet completed it, no worries at all, because it's already linked in your agenda. And then Amelia can also drop a link in the chat as we go along so that you have time to rate yourself. Okay. All right. Next slide. All right, so we're going to start with co-creation and engagement. As implementation support practitioners, we know we need to promote and facilitate the active involvement of all stakeholders or critical perspectives, you'll hear me say sometimes, and making sure that they are all involved in all stages of the design and implementation process. Now, this results in service models, approaches, and practices that are contextualized and tailored to the specific settings. And this helps to ensure that the programs, practices, and implementation work actually matches the values, needs, skills, and resources of those with a stake in the implementation process. Now, this includes not only the people that are delivering or the groups delivering the programs and practices, but it also includes the consumers and the beneficiaries of those services. So now the core competencies that support co-creation include co-learning, brokering, addressing power differentials, co-design, and tailoring support. So let's dive in and take a look at each one of those. Next slide. All right, co-learning. So as implementation support practitioners, we need to work collaboratively with system stakeholders or critical perspectives to learn how implementation science can be effectively used in the local context. And we need to actively seek to learn about the culture, history, and current priorities of the local context in order to assess the most feasible and relevant uses of implementation science. And we need to support learning among all critical perspectives at the implementing site, as well as ourselves. Okay? And then recommend specific implementation strategies based on that local context. So what exactly does that look like? So one example would be conducting interactive trainings focused on implementation science to enable all critical perspectives or stakeholders to learn together. And then also another example would be to be able to support the collaborative development of implementation plans so that teams and stakeholders can learn together and develop a shared vision. So all that relates to our work. And I also saw in the chat as we go along, thinking about how these then relate to the driver. So we can talk about that as we go through as well. All right, so next slide, please. Brokering. As implementation support practitioners, we work to enable knowledge exchange and information among stakeholders to increase understanding of the design and implementation of the program or practice. And we act as that bridge. We're that bridge between the people and the groups that are vital for the success of an implementation. So we can help them be able to exchange and share that knowledge. But we also need to be able to help them pool information and leverage their resources to enable them to make decisions across the organization. So again, what does that look like? So an example is promoting intra and interdepartmental or agency work to strengthen a specific process or practice. So for example, if you're thinking about that interagency or interdepartmental work, as implementation support practitioners, we may be the ones that are bridging the connections between referral agencies and maybe service agencies to help strengthen the referral process. But then also we can help them share information so that they can also be able to strengthen their access to services for whatever the focus population is. Right? Next slide, please. All right, addressing power differentials. So another part of our work as implementation support practitioners should be to address power imbalances between community members and others within the wider system. Power differentials exist when individuals involved in the implementation process are perceived to have greater authority, agency, or influence over others. And this could be due to different professions, so whatever that person's title is. It could be gender identities, race or ethnicity, age, organizational hierarchies. All of those different perceptions can cause power differentials. So to address power differentials, as implementation support practitioners, we need to help build trust. And we need to support bidirectional communication so that everyone has the opportunity to provide feedback and give input and be heard. We also need to cultivate opportunities for mutual consultation and collaboration. And also in doing that, we need to help identify accountabilities. So bringing to light whatever those power differentials are and bringing to light what are those different roles and responsibilities of each person that is contributing to implementation. So what does that look like? So this could be, as implementation support practitioner, you're using your facilitation skills to make power structures visible and work to ensure that all voices are heard throughout the implementation process. So not just in the planning, but throughout the process. One way to do that is gathering and using feedback from multiple levels of an organization, and then helping them to create a meeting space where all voices are valued. Right? Next slide, please. Co-design. So co-design, as implementation support practitioners, we should have the competency to be able to promote the co-design of practices, programs, and their implementation. And we need to also co-design implementation tools, resources, and models throughout the iterative processes and collective sense-making, And finally, making sure that we're including leaders, practitioners, and people with the lived experiences. Who knows this? Who's being impacted by this? Who's experienced this? And making sure that they have a part in that co-design process. So again, thinking about that, what does it look like? And one example would be facilitating design meetings where tools and resources are developed with the involvement of multiple perspectives. And if they can be developed in real time, getting that actual input makes it even stronger so that people have the opportunity to be able to share their ideas and give their input in final products. Okay. All right, next slide. And our last core competency for this domain is tailored support. So as implementation support practitioners, we need to help tailor the implementation strategies used by stakeholders based on a deep learning and understanding of the local context. And we need to tailor our support. And thinking about that, we need to think about the frequency of our support, the duration, and the intensity, based on the needs, goals, and context of those with the stake in implementation. And finally, we need to refrain from making assumptions about the level of and types of support that is needed. So again, what does that look like? So one example would be collaborating with the implementing site to decide on the number and timing of support activities, such as trainings or site visits, rather than deciding those ahead of time. Sometimes as we come in and we're providing support, we may have to put together a proposed plan, but it's important to also be flexible to make sure that we adjust that plan to meet the needs of the implementing site. This could also look like assessing the effectiveness of the implementation support that we're providing by seeking feedback to ensure that our support matches those needs, goals, and contexts of implementation of the implementation effort. Okay. All right. So now we're going to take a moment and reflect on your practice, where you're going to get a chance to rate yourself on the co-creation and engagement domains and the core competencies. And if you have the sheet in front of you, those are the first 5 listed on that implementation specialist competencies rating form. So I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca to let you know the next steps to do with the Menti we have developed for you today.
Okay, well, thank you, Yolanda, for that great description of those core competencies. We want to measure to see how you guys feel you rate yourself on these particular items, and we're going to do that with Menti. So you can go to www.menti.com, and I'll have Amelia drop that in the chat as well. And you're going to enter code 40940569, and that will take you to the first rating that we're going to have today on these particular core competencies. It's audience-based, so you can go ahead and click right through, and then we'll take a look at the results as a group. So I'll give you a few minutes to enter your ratings. So the ratings are matching, just same with the worksheet that we sent out. So 1 to 10 rating, 1 being no skill set, no competency, no strength in that area, all the way up to 10. So I'll give you a minute.
And this is anonymous, right, Rebecca?
Yeah.
Just to give a safe place to reflect and see how we're feeling as a group and where we're at with these competencies.
Yep, this is an opportunity for us to collect information from our participants, also to then contextualize our last presentation of the series. So we're super excited to collect this information. All right, that data is coming in. I'm super excited to share this. Okay. I'll keep an eye on those numbers. Give it about 1 more minute to get you a chance to go through.
And I'll just jump in really quickly, Rebecca. I did see in the chat someone asked about connecting the competencies with the drivers. And one connection that I make as I was looking at those specific competencies I was discussing is that they go along well with the organization drivers, if you look through, because it really is about developing those supports and those infrastructures to be able to create an environment where new programs and innovations can be used. So that is one of the little connections that I made as I went through. I wanted to just address it since it was in the chat.
Thank you, Yolanda. I'm going to go ahead and show our results. All right, so co-learning. Looks like the majority of our participants feel they're 7, right? It's always a comfortable, 7's always a comfortable number. You can say, I know this, I'm pretty good at this, but then you always leave yourself some room for growth. So, and then let's take a look at brokering. 7 rules out again. Look at that. Oh, addressing power differentials is so challenging. I will share some stories today, but it's always that, how far do you push and how far do you help them adjust and remove some of those barriers when it comes to power differentials. So I'm not surprised by those numbers. That's an area I need to grow in as well. Co-design. I'm loving the fact that we're a little higher in co-design. I think as facilitators and coaches and support specialists, we love doing that type of work. And tailored support, once again. All right, any thoughts from Karen or Yolanda regarding the results on these first 5 competencies?
No, it's good to see the amount of people that are comfortable with a lot of those competencies, as you said, that 7 and those 8s being a higher. And hopefully, as we all get to knowing that we're all coming into the space as learners, that as we learn from one another, then all of us will feel a lot more comfortable with each one of those competencies and can learn from one another about some strategies to use. So I'm interested in hearing some of the conversations that will happen today.
I would agree, Yolanda. I appreciate some of the vulnerability of folks that they put out there with putting out where they feel comfortable, where they in their reflection where they fall. A couple of them look like a normal distribution too, which was interesting as well. Can help my little statty hat coming out there.
So we will be sharing the results of these ratings with you guys when we send out the recording. So you'll be able to take a closer look at them as well.
And I think, Rebecca, when I think about some of those where we had more people hire on other ends, that's traditionally where we have spent time and training and development on, and we have not as explicitly called out and paid attention to some of those other ones that are really tricky, or tricky wiki, as you know, I like to say, in addressing power differentials, for example. All right, so let's dive into, I get to talk about the domain of ongoing improvement, which you all know, if you know me well, I'm all about the data and engaging in these cycles of inquiry. So I giggled that I got assigned this section as we go forward. So this domain of ongoing improvement, right? This is where, as implementation support practitioners, we're trying to support the agencies, the individuals that we're working with to really develop as a culture of learning, right? To value data, to kind of have that absorptive capacity to be able to use data and feedback and use that information to make improvements and to learn from and be willing to learn from. As I love to say, I always want to know where I've screwed up, where I've made mistakes, because I tend to learn more from those. I value that learning in many ways just as much as valuing the learning from the successes that we have as we go forward. And this is really talking about both quantitative data as well as the qualitative data and the use of the voices from those that we are working to support, those that are implementing, our implementers, as well as the intended beneficiaries or those critical perspectives in the community as we go forward. So there's a number of core competencies that have been identified as the skills that we need in order to do that well. So the first one we're going to dive into is really assessing needs and assets, right? So when we're supporting an organization or an agency in their implementation work, we have to work with the staff, with their community members, with leaders, with the recipients, who's going to be on the receiving end of that evidence-based practice or the program, to really understand where do they see the opportunities within their system, within their organization and their community, what might be presenting as needs, and where do they see what's working well and needs to be leveraged and built upon as strengths or as an asset, with going in with that asset-based mindset. So we're really working closely and collecting that information through a variety of different means, whether that's having meetings with different stakeholders, whether that's collecting survey data, is that conducting empathy interviews. There's numbers of activities that we as implementation support practitioners can support an organization, a team, or working with our individuals to really kind of step back and determine where are those opportunities, where are the strengths and the assets to be leveraged within this work, and value those different perspectives. And we don't just, a key learning for me is that does not only happen at the beginning of implementation work, right? Too often we see where folks will do a needs assessment, they collect it, they make a decision, and they keep going, and they don't come back and revisit or continually assess those opportunities. And we talk about context, we know that context shifts and changes, right? So how do we continuously do that within our implementation work? We can go on to the next slide. Thanks, Rebecca, which then connects to understanding context, right? We say all the time that context matters, right? We have to be aware and knowledgeable of the context that we're working within. And there's various types of context, right? We've got the social political landscape, we got the funding landscape, the community context, we have the legislative context, or that is the political as we work forward, but those various types. And those different types of contexts are interdependent, they're dynamic, so they're going to be fluid, they're going to change over time. And they can either be an asset or a barrier, or they can be both within our implementation efforts, right? New policy or legislation can really enable something to take place, and it can also be a barrier at the same time to our implementation efforts. Maybe sometimes with the expectations that we're going big, right? Statewide, right from the beginning, as an example, as we go forward. So as implementation specialists, we have to understand that context, right? We have to know what's happening and be able to navigate it and have a way of determining, is this an asset? Is this going to be a barrier? And what are the mitigating actions if it's going to be a barrier, or if it's both an asset and a barrier? And we have to be able to engage the community and the different various perspectives to see that and to hear that. Often we're external and we're not living there. Maybe we are, which is a bonus, so we're knee deep in it. But we have to think about the different mechanisms that we have in place to really understand that context, whether we're in it or we're out of it, as we go forward. We look at the next competency, right? This is the, some ways the heart, the meat, the potatoes, is the applying and integrating the implementation science approaches, right? So as implementation support practitioners, we have to stay on top of what we know as to be effective frameworks, strategies, methods, tools from the field of implementation science, both from what's emerging from implementation research and what's emerging from from implementation practice. What are we learning from the doing as well? And so being knowledgeable of that, to use that to inform our work with groups to really help identify the implementation frameworks or strategies or tools that are going to best fit their context and meet their needs and their specific implementation work that they're engaged in. So this requires us to be systems thinking, be able to really facilitate others being a part of the design of that implementation approach and strategies using participatory methods, and really exchanging that knowledge. And that's also going to pull on that brokering and the power differential and those other competencies that Yolanda was describing for us. Then we look at facilitation. And facilitation is really about convening in my mind, right? When we're convening our teams that we're supporting, when we're working with the various groups, how are we ensuring that we are setting a safe space for individuals to learn from each other and have those candid, open conversations around the implementation work? We know implementation is messy. It's never black and white. We live in the gray world, and we need to be able to have that safe psychological space in order to ask the hard questions and to learn from each other. So how do we, in our facilitation strategies, as we support the convenings of those, create those spaces? What are the different methods or techniques or strategies that we're using to ensure all voices are being heard? What are the strategies that we're taking to address the power differentials that may be inhibiting engaging those different voices? A favorite strategy of mine, it's an oldie but a goodie, is that nominal group process technique. I'm not sure if folks remember that one from the 70s. It's got different names to it now, but it is, and if it's a way to ensure that we're getting voices as a concrete example there. And that we're stepping back and taking that perspectives of others, we're engaging in that collaborative problem solving, and we're really promoting shared responsibility, right? As implementation support practitioners, kind of like a little litmus test we do is, are we working harder than the organization and the teams that we're trying to support? If we are, that's a red flag, right? Are we creating that shared responsibility among that team as we go forward? So what's our facilitation techniques and strategies that we're using to promote that shared responsibility? Go to the next one. Communication. We should have had Rebecca talk about this one. She loves communication. We know that communication can make or break an implementation effort, right? We want to support the development of communication processes and really ensure that we're tailoring them to the audiences that we're trying to target within our communication, right? That we're ensuring the information is relevant, it's concrete, it's clear. And I love that, as Dan Heath says in Making It Stick, that it elicits emotions, right? We want to ensure that those communication messages meet that criteria, but that communication processes create that bi-directional loop so that we're also on the receiving end of those communications and we're able to facilitate that sharing between different teams, among different groups. And so we think about those vertical loops, that feedback loops that need to be created within a system, as well as horizontal, right, among teams that may be at the same level of the system as we work through. Finally, as I said, my favorite, right, is conducting those improvement cycles, right? So how do we support the teams, the organizations that we're working with as support practitioners and engage in as ourselves those cycles of inquiries, right? Where we're starting small and we're testing improvements or changes that we're making to the practice that's being implemented, as well as the implementation activities. And we're learning from those cycles of testing. It helps us celebrate the successes. It helps us also identify where there are barriers that need to be addressed. And we're testing our hypotheses, right? Like what we think is going to the underlying theory of change that we have that's guiding and driving our work. We also need, as implementation support practitioners, is to support that a cycle of inquiry becomes standard routine, right? That we're building in routine processes for reviewing data, analyzing data, using that disaggregated data. Is that built into every agenda? I know I have a bunch of colleagues on today from Minnesota, and Minnesota has driven that lesson home, that if teams don't have data flowing within several months of getting up and going, they're going to spin out, right? We know data is like currency to our implementation work. It keeps us moving as we go forward. So just a little bit on improvement cycles there. Want to give you a chance when you think about that domain of ongoing improvement. where would you rate yourselves in engaging in those various competencies and skills? So again, we're going to go back to the Menti, give you that moment for reflection, and then Rebecca will show us the results.
It's always great when you start to see the data come in, because I know the link worked, the code worked. I'm like, whew, okay, we're good.
You got to show us the data as it's coming. That's one thing I love about Menti is how it updates.
Oh, I can do that if you want.
Yeah, you're teasing us. Thanks, Rebecca.
You're welcome. I like the curtain unveil.
I know where I like to see it shift and change.
We'll pop back and forth. Understanding context. These are really interesting to look at as they're popping in. I don't know what Karen and Yolanda think, but a few more minutes. Get a couple more people adding their ratings into that Menti. All right, I think we've slowed down a little bit.
Yeah, we look to be about the same number that we were, I think, last time.
Yep, we're getting there.
Close to it.
Okay. All right, so assessing needs. We fall primarily, our group, the majority falls about 30% at 7%. As Karen indicated, I have noticed as well, it's almost like there's that curve starting at 7 on a lot of these slides as we go through and rate. So let's take a look at understanding context. It's a nice almost ladder climb up to 7, right? Nice general stretch there. I struggle with this one. I would actually rate myself probably at like a 5 because I struggle taking the time to ask the right questions. Sometimes I like to jump right in and fix things. So this is always an area that I need to focus on as well.
We're problem solvers.
All right. An interesting mix here with integrating those implementation science frameworks and strategies and approaches. I think we're all learners in this area on a regular basis. I know internally we spend a lot of time at NIRN learning on a regular basis. What's new? What's the research tell us? What are some strategies? How can we dig deeper? Facilitation. I was hoping this one was going to be strong. The majority of our participants have indicated that this is their job. They have some experience with this. So I think a lot of us have a comfort in the area of facilitation. And communication looks to be about a normal bell curve, almost a little bit higher ended one on 8. And then conducting improvement cycles flattens out a little bit more. We have some great resources on communication, on improvement cycles. You can always check out at the hub to help you as we kind of dig further in.
I wonder with the conducting improvement cycles, I often make an assumption that teams know how to use data and working with them. And then it like smacks me up and I'm like, oh, we didn't go over it. You know what I mean? Like, so I'm working with other folks supporting implementation. I always love to ask the favorite question. Well, did we take them through did we teach them how to use the data, like go through a data review process and make that systematic? And often that's missing. Yeah, Maureen, data literacy is a huge area of need. That's a much more eloquent way to say it than what I'm saying this morning, this afternoon.
Okay. Well, thank you for participating in that particular Menti, and we're going to turn it back over, I think, to Yolanda for the next section.
Thank you, Rebecca. And it is so interesting to see that data coming in real time and seeing how people rate themselves. Because as you were saying before, Rebecca, even for me, when I look at them, there's those areas that I'm like, I want to be a lot stronger in certain areas, and then others that I feel more comfortable with. So it's just good to see how we all are reflecting on our practice. All right. So sustaining change. I was excited to have the opportunity to talk about this one because as a team, as the NIRN team, we had a discussion about sustainability and exactly what did that mean. So just thinking about sustaining change, but a general description of that would be that programs and practices are sustained when adequate capacity exists to maintain and deliver those practices after initial implementation support has been withdrawn. So we as implementation support practitioners can advance the sustainability by helping communities to develop a shared vision and a mutual accountability. We can also help promote sustainability by facilitating any existing relationships, helping to develop problem solving and processes and support resource sharing. And we can also help to identify, understand, and address the dynamic changes that are bound to occur over time by supporting the core competencies of grow and sustain relationships, develop teams, build capacity, cultivate leaders and champions. So we're going to take a look at each one of those competencies. Okay, next slide. So as implementation support practitioners, we recognize that relationships are foundational to the implementation work that we do. Because if people don't trust us, if people do not think that we are bringing something to the relationship, then we're not able to support them with that implementation work. So we have to spend time making personal connections. But we also have to recognize that we are outsiders to the implementation setting. So as Karen was discussing understanding context, we're coming into a new setting to support them with that, or we may be coming into a new setting to support teams with implementation work. So we need to take the time to support two different types of relationships. One of them being the relationship between us, the implementation support practitioner, and any key stakeholders or critical perspectives, as well as helping to support relationships among systems and the community members. And those community members include, again, consumers and beneficiaries of the services. Okay? So these relationships are then also built on two types of trust. There's the interpersonal trust, and that's the belief that the person is reliable, competent, and committed to change on the behalf of the organization. So we have to have whoever's working with us have that feeling, that interpersonal trust with us, but we also need to enter the space and have that trust with others. Okay. And then there's the interpersonal trust, and that's the perception that the implementation support practitioner and the critical perspectives or stakeholders are in a collaborative and reciprocal relationship for the same goal. So making sure that each feels valued and providing input into that relationship. Okay. So thinking about that, we still on that one for a second there. I just want to give a little example or thinking about what that could possibly look like. So as I mentioned, that trust is foundational to a relationship. And so we need to do things such as employ honest, empathetic, and active listening to show that we care about the stakeholders and critical perspectives in the full implementation process. To support this growing and sustaining relationships, we also need to think about demonstrating commitment and persistence by helping them work through any difficult situations. And then we also need to make sure that during the process, we're providing meaningful feedback, but then also asking for and then using feedback from those multiple perspectives so that we can tailor our support. So again, you might see some connection between some of these competencies to the ones that I talked about earlier, as well as the ones that Karen talked about. All right, now next slide. I get happy about growing and sustaining relationships. So I'll talk all day about that one. But our next competency is developing teams. So implementation research has identified teams as a key ingredient for facilitating change efforts. And research has shown that using implementation teams to actively and intentionally support change can help produce higher rates of success more quickly than if we use the traditional methods of implementation that do not have an active teaming approach. So when we're talking about the implementation teams, these are the individuals who are accountable for the selection, implementation, and improvement of a program or practice. They are not the ones that are doing all the work, but they are accountable for making sure that it gets done. So as implementation support practitioners, we should also support the developing and coaching of these teams, as well as developing the stakeholder leadership by making sure that multiple perspectives are included during the planning, communication, problem solving, and the decision-making using data. Okay. So that can look like helping teams develop meeting processes that are structured and effective, such as regular meeting times or providing an agenda template, or helping them think about collaboration protocols, because as we've been mentioning through today, making sure that everyone has a chance for their voice to be heard. This can also look like helping the teams develop a team charter that has meeting norms or working agreements to help them identify their roles and responsibilities in the implementation process. Okay. Next slide. Building capacity. So this is done by helping to increase the knowledge, skills, motivation, and attitudes of all the stakeholders or critical perspectives to achieve the implementation goals. And as implementation support practitioners, we need to be able to attend to all types of capacity at all levels of the system. And it's related to the four types of capacity we have listed here. So there's intervention-specific capacity, and this relates to a specific intervention or program, such as understanding the research basis of that selected program. There's the general capacity. That relates to the functioning of an organization or system, such as thinking about human resources, the field leadership positions, maybe department and unit vacancies. Analytic capacity, that's the ability to gather information about a problem, recognize and then analyze the patterns and dynamics to critically identify the root causes of possible solutions. So as Karen was talking about, we can't just assume just because they collected the data, but how then do the teams have the analytic capacity to use that data to inform decisions and support the implementation process? And then there's the adaptive capacity, and that's the ability to adjust actions and strategies in response to an analysis. So an example of that would be working with critical perspectives or stakeholders to assess their capacity so they can determine any areas of strength and need. This could also be providing training to the teams or the others in the process based on those capacity needs determined by the assessment. Or you could possibly just be connecting them with others who can provide that training or modeling and coaching. But as we're doing that, we need to make sure that the learning activities are safe and relevant and beneficial so that we are thinking about the context that everyone is in so that it is an effective process. Another example would be to help them identify potential challenges, and those could be internal challenges or external challenges, so they can then develop strategies to build sufficient capacity to meet those. And as implementation support practitioners, we may also help with them learning about facilitation skills. So that goes back to when Karen was talking about facilitation. So all of that builds and goes together, right? Now, next slide. And finally, we have cultivating leaders and champions. So as implementation support practitioners, we need to have the competency to support formal leaders to be implementation leaders who work across organizations and systems boundaries to promote collaboration. So again, there we are, there's some brokering going on there. There's the fostering of the leadership behavior among all stakeholders or critical perspectives to create a space for new and emerging implementation leaders. And then thinking about how we can cultivate implementation champions at all multiple levels or in various settings to get different perspectives, because these are the people that will influence opinions and behaviors of others that are working towards a specific goal in the implementation process. And they'll be able to help instill a sense of ownership over the implementation effort and hopefully also demonstrate persistence in the face of setbacks. So an example of this could be supporting leaders with accessing data and information to help them stay abreast of the implementation work. Or it could be supporting emerging leaders to share responsibilities and develop their competence and competency by asking them to help co-facilitate meetings. Another example would be collaborating with stakeholders to identify champions within and outside the system that may have the potential to positively influence the implementation efforts. Okay. All right. So now it's time again for that self-reflection. So we're going to ask you again to take a moment to rate yourself on the core competencies in the sustaining change domain. And once again, you'll go into the Menti, put that code in, and as you go through it, Rebecca will share those results with us.
I will. I won't hide them this time. Karen wants to see them come in. Okay, looks like it's slowing down a little bit. So let's take a look at these results as they're shifting just a smidge here and there. So grow and sustain relationship. The majority of us feel we're about an 8 in this particular area. We feel it's a strength of ours. Some of us, there's a few of us in this space that needs to work on this a little bit more. When we think about grow and sustain relationships and how to improve, a lot of it is taking the time to put those emotional pennies into the penny bank, right? Like making the time to have conversations and get to know who we're working with, even in an informal way, learning about their personal life as well, and really getting to know who they are as individuals. When we think about developing teams, I'm a team developer. I love developing teams and watching teams grow. The majority of us rated ourselves as a 7 here, so room for growth in regards to really focusing in on those team structures, the team dynamics, and helping teams kind of push through and become solid moving teams. Building capacity is at a 7 and almost like a perfect, look at that. It's pretty sharp at 7 and then drops off on both sides. When we think about building capacity, this is a lot of the work that we do. This is why we do the work that we do, right? We really want to help these organizations build that internal capacity. And then cultivating leadership. The majority of us are at about a 7 as well. It's once again a nice kind of bell curve within the space. When we think about cultivating leadership, I think one of the pieces is really honing in on the informal leadership structure and who has the voice. Just because you don't have the title doesn't mean you're not a leader, right? And really honing in on those individuals with potential and cultivating the champions within that space.
All right. So I think we've got everybody back. Is that right, Rebecca?
Yep, everybody is back.
Awesome. Okay, well, as you're coming back, please feel free to drop into that chat an appreciation or a note to your breakout group in which you were sharing your reflection with. Now that we've driven deeper a little bit into what those the competencies are within those 3 domains, we really wanted to center our discussion today around initial implementation, the stage of initial implementation. So Rebecca, you can go to the next slide. As we know, when we think about the implementation stages, with that key reminder that they are not linear, we can be in multiple stages at one time, and we can go back and revisit stages. The initial implementation is the stage in which in installation, we delivered our professional learning or the training that was needed. In initial implementation, our implementers are at work putting the practice into use, right? They're using the practice with the intended beneficiaries. And data is a huge component of initial implementation, where data is beginning to flow, or if it should be flowing already, but it's definitely flowing now, where we're getting implementation data on the use of that practice that's being used. And we're using that practice to make improvement to the various implementation activities that we've been putting into place, right? And there are a variety of outcomes that we should be achieving, or benchmarks that we should be achieving within initial implementation. One is our target group of implementers. The majority of them are using that program or practice. As I said, we're using that data is flowing regularly. Implementation data is flowing regularly to inform our decision-making and improve those activities. We're monitoring the impact data, right, as well. And we're really starting to see that the use of the practice with fidelity based on the data we're collecting is improving, right? We're seeing that be achieved within the use of the practice or program. And we might have some variability still among our different implementers and practitioners as we go forward. And then we also have the goal of that we're seeing more and more evidence for the feasibility of the program, right? As we're using data to make improvements, we should be seeing it's more and more feasible to use. Now, on this slide is one of my favorite notes about initial implementation. Karen Blase, one of our co-founders, if you know her, she loves analogies. And one of the analogies she gave for initial implementation just has always stuck with me. And it is that analogy of a pancake, okay? When you're making pancakes, right, and it's your first pancake off the griddle, that first pancake usually is not great, right? It usually comes out burnt around the edges, gooey in the center. It's not a great pancake. And normally the cook needs to eat that pancake, or maybe we give it to the dog, or I make my husband eat it, right? And the reason why that pancake is gooey in the middle or burnt around the edges is because that griddle that we're cooking that pancake on is not set to the right temperature. Now, where am I going with this? The griddle is our implementation infrastructure, right? It's the activities, the infrastructure that is supporting the use of the practice, or in this case, the pancake, right? So initial implementation is a fragile stage, right? It's going to be gooey in the middle. It's going to be burnt around the edges, because we've got to be fine-tuning those implementation activities or that griddle to get to the right temperature, right? And we do that through the use of data for improvement. Now, with a trick in our work of implementation as support practitioners is to keep the group motivated and persist through getting that griddle to the right temperature until we get those fluffy golden pancakes flying off, and the practices are happening with fidelity and high quality and use as we go forward, right? So that is one of my favorite analogies, and we have to keep going and not give up, right? We just don't turn the griddle off and say, well, that didn't work, and go on to maybe making something else, right? So or going to another practice, right? And too often we see that kind of cycle of going back and forth between initiatives because we don't give enough time to get that griddle to the right temperature. So that's why we say initial implementation is fragile. It's an awkward stage. It's gooey, it's middle, it's burning around the edges, but we just got to keep going and get that temperature to the right place. So that's what we're hoping to do, all right, achieve an initial implementation. So what does that mean in terms of activities? This means we're having regularly scheduled implementation team meetings. And in those meetings, we're using data, right? If we don't have a meeting without a data, why are we here, right? So we're using data to critically improve. And I know I've got my good colleague, Ellen Nasik on the line. She would say, and the right data, right? That we're not just looking at our impact data, outcome data, but we're looking at that the implementation process and fidelity or integrity data as we go forward. Our practitioners are using the practice. We're giving them feedback on the use of the practice, providing those necessary coaching supports. We're continuing that training and professional learning. We're gathering feedback and information from those that are being impacted by the practice and those that are supporting the use. So those feedback loops are going into action. And we're making decisions on what are the criteria for scale up, right? And we're applying those decisions to say, are we ready to expand the use of the practice, the reach of the practice based on what our data is looking like? So what does this mean for what the competencies look like in initial implementation? What we wanted to do next was just kind of stop sharing the screen, and Yolanda and I share some reflections about what has been our experiences, what barriers we've encountered or challenges in initial implementation, and how has that meant for the competencies? How has that come into play? So I think, Rebecca, were you going to ask us those questions that I just foreshadowed?
That was exactly it. We thought we would just take some time and share with you guys exactly. We struggle as implementation specialists helping teams through initial implementation. And we're asking you to do that here shortly. So let's just go ahead and dive right in. And I'm really curious, either from Karen or Yolanda, whichever one wants to start, is, what are some of those key challenges? And can you give us an example of what you're currently facing maybe in a project?
I can start if you want, Karen.
That sounds great.
I just thought it was funny because Rebecca gave us the heads up that she was going to ask this question. And I'm like, you want us to pick one challenge? I'm like there's just one thing. So that was like my challenge. Let's just pick one thing. But I will say one thing that's coming to my mind a lot more, and even in our discussion today, is about data. And just thinking about one team that I have worked with, and we were doing a district capacity assessment. And as we were doing that with the school district team, they rated themselves high with being able to use different types of data, which I was like, woo, yay, because that doesn't always happen. As Karen was saying, sometimes they focus on just one or two types of data, but they rated themselves high on being able to use different types of data. But then notice that they were inconsistent with scoring themselves on having access to the data and then having a process for using that data. And so, that then came about in these discussions of team members realizing they not all have access to the data. So that started to address some of the competencies we talked about. And one that really came up was capacity building, specifically analytic capacity building, because how can you make decisions if not everyone is able to see this data? But it also impacted developing teams because then they can't have the multiple perspectives to give their input. But a big one that came up was the power differentials. If we're all on the team and we're supposed to be able to make these decisions, if not everyone has access to the data, then there is a power differential going on. And then we had to sit and think about how can we address that? Because then we're giving more information to one set of individuals than we're giving to another, but we're all expected to be able to give input on this team. So that was just one thing that came up. So that's something we're still working through. I mean, we took the team and we had that discussion and we talked about, okay, next steps, the research analysts, making sure that listing out what were all the different types of data being used that we had in the measurement plan, who has access to it, how can we get them access? But it's a constant conversation of making sure that not only are we providing access and being transparent with our the community members and with the beneficiaries, but how even on the team are we addressing those power differentials? So that was just one that came up for me as I was thinking about it. But as I said, I can come up with more because there's always a challenge. It's messy.
Forgot I muted myself. It is messy. Thanks, Yolanda, for sharing that challenge that you've encountered and thinking about how you've pulled on different competencies to address that in this stage. Before I share mine, is there any reactions or thoughts or questions from you all and relate to the challenge that Yolanda shared? I'm going off script. I hope Rebecca's okay with that. Always working on my wait time.
This is Ellen from Minnesota. I suspect, it has a lot to do with self ratings are just one piece of information, and being able to triangulate multiple sources of information. And the better we can do on our self ratings to have more operationalized behaviors that can be observed, to help with maybe, the accuracy and also the ability to talk to somebody else, around if they're seeing that or not. So just some thoughts, random thoughts that kind of came to mind. Thanks.
Thanks, Ellen.
One of the things that our groups talked about was some of the barriers that were outside of our control. For example, was turnover. When teams that we're working with have high turnover and it looks like Groundhog Day every year or 6 months, it's really hard to build some of those competencies, because some people may dig in and they'll have a mind shift to say, well, it doesn't matter because it turns over all the time, so I'm not going to buy into this. Or every time you're trying to develop the team, you have a whole new set of team members and you got to go back. And, when you showed that one about going back and forth, you think you're here, you got to go all the way back to that initial, because that team may come in with a whole new set of ideas and directions in which they want to go. And so trying to build that capacity as the consultant is very challenging. And so it makes you look at the ratings like, well, I don't get to do this, but is that truly a good rating on yourself? Or is it because those barriers make it very difficult to really successfully rate those things because of those environmental factors? You still have to overcome them, but we were talking about some of those barriers.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that, I would say that there's also a lot of turnover at the executive sponsorship level, especially in district turnover, and no longer is the implementation you're working on a high priority for fulfilling that implementation.
Yeah, you both are hitting on the challenge. When Rebecca posed this to us, that I was thinking about was turnover, right? I have an organization that I'm working as their implementation support practitioner. And I've had a turnover in a key champion, right? When they weren't an executive sponsor, but they were like right there, the next level of the system of being a key champion that I was heavily supporting to develop the competency within and leader of the implementation work for the initiative. And so when I was reflecting on, well, what does that mean for me as their support practitioner and my competencies? Where am I shifting already or leverage? Drawing on, you know what I mean, because of this change. I went to tailoring support, that competency of knowing how to tailor support. Because of this shift, I'm having to ramp up the intensity of my support to that organization right now to support them through this transition, right? With losing that key person. So the intensity of my support and some of my strategies that I've been using. And I also had to step back and assess context and need, because the context is different now from when that position was originally formulated to lead this implementation work. That was over a year ago. We've had political changes. We've had new prioritizations come into play. We've had an executive leader change at the very top of the organization. So I had to step back as an implementation support practitioner and draw on that competency of looking at the context, assessing what's changed, and how do I use those changes, which some days in my mind they're barriers, and then as an asset at this moment to revisit this position with the organization and help them as a learning organization identify what worked well in that position, what did not work so well, and what improvements can we make so that when it gets filled, which we're going to fill, that we can set that up for success and address some barriers that we were hitting. So it's messy. It was not a great time for that position to turn over, but whenever is that a good time in turnover of positions? But those were just a couple implications about how I was having to rely on some different competencies to pull up and support at that time. Yeah, Kathy, and the team, right? So you're exactly spot. So my example is highlighting the power of the implementation team, right? So it's a key position, right? But I still have that team. She was the facilitator of that team, right? The coordinator of that team. So how am I supporting and empowering others for the team to come into that facilitation role and lead while they work to get this position filled, and the work is still going because that team is in place that was built in support. So the work's not necessarily slowing down as we work to do that. Yeah, Amy, and the importance of cultivating leadership, right? Absolutely. If you want to say more to that. Thoughts, reactions to that example before we hop into our next activity? Was that helpful to hear from Yolanda and I as we think about common challenges and what competencies we pull on those challenges in initial implementation?
So what are our next steps? We have one more session, one more left in November. So we are super excited. As always, we will take into consideration all the information, especially the Mentimeter results, as we start to develop and design that last session for you and really contextualize the information. We will be sure to share with you the recording from today, as well as the results from that survey. And we will conduct our final session in November. And from there, we're hoping to produce kind of the product for the next step in supporting the work around the core competencies. So I'm going to have Amelia drop in the chat the link to today's feedback survey. We want to make sure we get your feedback. I scour those results. I look at them very, very closely to ensure that we are creating the best experience for you, as this is the first time NIRN's kind of done a virtual series in this manner. Registration for November 16th, the session is almost full. It is almost full. So we are excited to kind of round this out in November. And then finally, as always, continue to dig through that core competency document. Keep your eye out for understanding context learning module. It'll be out about that same time as our final session. So we wanted to make sure we gave you plenty of time to complete that survey and remind you of some resources that you can always jump into, and the Active Implementation Hub, the ISP Lessons and Resources, and always the event page. So with the Active Implementation Hub, if you are looking for resources around being an implementation support practitioner, we've got this great piece right here. You just click on it, and that's where the lessons are located. So there'll be a box here that says Understanding Context coming soon. And then you can, as always, visit the core competencies practice profile, as well as the guidance document. The events page is where all today's materials will be located. Once the recording is cleaned up and processed, you'll be able to find it here. And as you can see, registration is in full swing still for the 4th session.